Is the SAT biased? Should it be banned? Maybe? Hi everybody, my name is Greg Hancock, and along with my incendiary friend Patrick Curran, we make up Quantitude. In today's In the Wild episode, we turn our Quantitude loose on the ever-present SAT, in particular the premise that it is biased and should be banned, and talk about what issues we would need to have addressed in order for us to be able to evaluate whether or not that's a reasonable claim. We hope you enjoy today's episode of Quantitude In the Wild.
We've learned from a lot of years of working together that we were pretty much cut from the same bolt of cloth growing up. And it should bother one of us. I'm just not sure which one.
It's very scary. You text me messages that I could have just texted to myself.
So I have a question for you. When you were a kid, did you ever do something with your friends that you knew was really risky and could go sideways on you in a big way, but that if it worked, it was going to be really, really cool?
I think I'd rather not answer because most of it involved explosives.
So like a tennis ball cannon?
I'd really rather not disclose.
Okay, for real. Did you ever make a tennis ball cannon?
I want to hear about your tennis ball cannon.
So, if anyone is driving and has their children in the car, I would suggest forwarding, I don't know, maybe 60 seconds because I'm going to tell you how to make a tennis ball cannon. It was back in the day when you bought tennis balls and they would come in a metal tube. And so what you would do is after school, go to a buddy's house whose parents worked during the day so that you were alone. You would take a tennis ball tube and you would very carefully crimp the sides so that the tennis ball would just wedge in the bottom. Then you make a little hole on the side at the very bottom. And then here's the tricky part. You put in some gasoline. I guess that's not the tricky part because then you have to light it. And if the design of this works, you could shoot a tennis ball like 100 yards. But one day we were doing this and we were arguing over who was going to light it. So we waited a little bit longer than usual and we did not realize that the tennis ball soaked up all the gasoline. Finally, one of us stuck a match through the hole. It worked flawlessly. But this flaming tennis ball shot like 3 houses down, bounced off a car and rolled into his garage. And so we ran down and were able to kick it out into the street until it burned out. Welcome back if you had kids in the car. As we talked about how important it was to study every day and not just before the test, because that's really what allows you to anchor the thing that you're learning.
That's an important message, kids. Yeah. Absolutely. The more you know. I'll tell you, one of the funniest things for me is why you led with with that. And that is because Patrick and I had discussed that today's episode is going to be talking about the SAT. I love that you framed this. How did you say the question?
Something that's kind of risky, but would be really cool if it worked, but not if it didn't. Those weren't my words, but that was how I feel about it. This is going to be awesome unless you shoot a flaming tennis ball into your neighbor's garage, and then it's not.
Yeah. So talking about the SAT is a tennis ball cannon. No, that's not what we want to say. It's when you raise the topic of the SAT, almost everybody has some kind of reaction to it. You have wanted to talk about the SAT for years, right?
I have. Yeah. I go up every summer. We have the whiteboard out on the back deck. It's 182 degrees out, but Greg is a game day player. We put down episodes, and I have been advocating for this since like early days. And you have always made a really good argument. Some of my other topics, your arguments are ridiculous and you're closed-minded.
Okay.
Because you're firstborn. We established that in a prior episode. But we just thought it is too big, it's too important, it's too complicated to do in a regular episode. But with the new format of In the Wild, we don't have to have some resolution to the question. The whole point is to talk about the premise and to identify what are the issues that are involved when we talk about it. Greg took a deep breath and said, okay, we can do it.
When I said that people have reactions to the SAT, I think we could use some of those reactions to phrase the premise for today. Patrick, can you tell us what the premise for today is?
We just want to keep it short and sweet. The premise of the In the Wild episode today is the SAT is biased and should be banned.
Boom.
That's it. That's the In the Wild premise.
A California lawmaker wants state universities to scrap standardized tests like the SAT altogether.
I can't tell you how many times I have heard words to that effect from all kinds of people, right? Whether you're with a group of parents whose kids are looking ahead to taking the SAT, or you are talking to college students, or to just about anybody, somebody has an opinion, and I will tell you, it is almost always phrased as some version of that.
And we want to be super clear in this episode that we don't have a presupposition about what the answer to that premise is. As all of you already know, it's vastly too complex to say yes it is or no it isn't. Greg and I have jointly put 5 kids into college. This is not our first rodeo with college admissions, with SAT prep. I have sat at the dining room table with your son while he explained to me the answer to some SAT questions that I didn't know. And he pointed out that I'm a tenured professor and he's a 17-year-old kid. And that might be an indicator of some deeper institutional problem that I didn't have the answer.
Hi, this is Quinn Hancock. The volume of a cone is 1/3 pi r squared h, where r is the radius of the circular base and h is the height of the cone, obviously.
But we're going to try to do what we've done in prior episodes of let's just pick through the premise and talk about what are the issues involved. Now, we unfairly focused on your brother-in-law for the NPR episode.
Yes.
Your mildly inebriated and heavily armed brother-in-law. All right, so just for argument, where you heard this premise is from your mildly inebriated and less well-armed sister-in-law. Okay. So you and I both have lovely sister-in-laws. I have a wonderful, wonderful sister-in-law, and I am not implying she has said this. I am not implying she is inebriated. I am not implying that she is armed, all right? But the microcosm we're going to focus on is you have a sister-in-law who's on her second glass of wine and says, well, everybody knows the SAT is biased and should be banned, and that's going to be our starting point.
And as a reminder, and I feel like I say this every time.
Okay, so this is a brief aside. I edited NPR, and I think Greg said this literally something like 8 times. Go ahead, I'm going to give you one, and then I'm going to cut out the rest. So please, what are you going to remind listeners of?
Okay. Well, as an In the Wild episode, our goal really isn't to resolve the issue about bias and whether or not the SAT should be banned. Our goal is to try to figure out what are the questions that we would need to ask to be able to have a more informed opinion on this particular issue. So as we take the premise that's laid out before us by Patrick's second glass of wine sister-in-law, we're going to go through the premise and try to say, well, what would that mean, right? What question would we have to ask to be able to be more informed on that issue?
And remember, one of the bonuses we hope of these episodes is that you get better and better at annoying the people who love you. It's just kind of a bonus from these.
I imagine you're already pretty good at that.
But let's have a little bit of a disclaimer here at the outset, because some people listening are international experts in standardized testing, in the SAT, in college admissions. Greg and I are going to kick this around for maybe half an hour, and we're barely skimming across the surface of some really complicated and really important issues. Mm-hmm. All right? Now, that's not to say that we don't have knowledge about these, but there are entire dissertations, there are entire books, there are federally funded research grants that look into these kinds of things. We are not going to adjudicate this problem in the next 28 minutes. We're just going to chat a little bit with you about what are the key issues that are involved.
Great, thank you. Why don't I just start with, where the heck does such a strong opinion come from that people think it is biased and that it should be banned? Patrick, you're a history guy. Do you think you could give us a little bit of where the SAT comes from?
I actually find it fascinating on a couple of levels because so many assumptions are made about the SAT, about the motivation of the SAT, about the institution that oversees that, which is something called College Board. And going back to earliest days, I just find really interesting to put things in context. The first documented use of the SAT was in 1926. It was overseen by something called the College Entrance Examination Board, and now we just call it College Board. The College Board is actually a 501(c)(3) nonprofit institution. A lot of people are like, it's big testing, they're just trying to make money, they're just trying to pay their stakeholders. Well, College Board is actually a nonprofit institution. Here's another interesting irony. Back in the early 20th century, almost all admissions to the elite colleges was based on whether a kid was enrolled in one of these private preparatory schools that would then feed into Harvard and Yale and so on. There was a move to make it, of all things, more democratic and equitable. So what they wanted to do was build a test to make admissions, again, somewhat ironically given the current conversation, based on merit to get access to these elite schools. Then we're off to the races, and it has grown and expanded and contracted over the decades. But what is really important to understand for our discussion here, and I think this is in part some of the source of the frustration some people express with the exam. It is not an assessment of innate intelligence or of creativity. It is explicitly a numerical measure of academic preparation in math, reading, and writing.
And we're using this test as sort of the lightning rod for conversation. But in fact, this is really a placeholder for lots of different standardized tests, right? So people don't just have strong feelings about the SAT, although they absolutely do. They have strong feelings about standardized testing much more broadly. So while we're talking about the SAT, if you want to mentally insert your other favorite test in here, there's a good chance that a lot of this conversation applies to that as well.
That's a wonderful point. And I got to tell you, this is another I see dead people kind of thing, because when you start thinking about testing, there is testing everywhere.
I see dead people all the time. They're everywhere.
Whether it's a 16-year-old gets a driver's license, whether your dentist has passed a minimum knowledge test to be able to drill into your face, whether you get onto a Southwest airline and wonder if the pilot has even seen an airplane before. These are endemic to everything that we do.
So let's take a look at this premise. The SAT is biased and should be banned. What we've done in the past, we've sort of parsed that along the way.
I like you said, like what we usually do.
Yeah.
Isn't this like our third one? So it's the medical school one where if you do a procedure once, you tell the patient, well, in my experience, if you've done the procedure twice, you say, well, in the series of procedures I've conducted, and if you've done it 3 times, you say, I have seen time and time and time again.
Well, we have done time and time again.
No, we haven't done that yet because this is the
fine.
time again.
All right, so let me poke the hole in the bottom of the tennis ball can here and get us started. When we were in the NPR episode, we also had this theme of bias. In that case, it was about political bias, possibly leaning more liberally versus leaning more conservatively. So the word bias was there, but it had a very different orientation. When we talk about bias in the case of the SAT, this is more about group comparison, that if this test is favoring a group that is different on the basis of race or ethnicity or wealth or gender or first language status, the existence of differences in performance by different subgroups is something that leads one to have questions about whether or not the instrument itself contains bias.
But here's where the conversation gets so fun, is in the upcoming minutes, we're going to pick apart that there are actually different kinds of bias that are extremely important to not lump together. So when you say the SAT is biased, we're going to describe that there are actually 3 ways that that can occur that are quite different from one another. And the one to start with is bias from a psychometric standpoint. I'm going to give a colloquial definition in bias, and remember, entire books have been written about that. Imagine there are two people who have the same latent math ability. Now, this is wildly untrue, but imagine it's me and Greg, and we have exactly the same latent math ability. Now, keep in mind, I have the mathematical skills of a fifth grader.
Are you smarter than a fifth grader? 'Cause it's gonna be a test later.
But setting that aside, that we have the same, and I'm going to use air quotes so that nobody can see, the same truth as God sees it, math ability. We sit side by side and we take the same exam. On average, doing that a very large number of times, an unbiased test would be that Greg and I would receive the same numerical score, reflecting that underlying testing, regardless of race, culture, language, rurality, family, wealth. It is independent of that. So a test is considered unbiased if it gives you the same score for two individuals who have the same latent ability, pooling across all individual differences. A test is biased if Greg were to get a higher score than me because of some characteristic of the test. That's the first bias. It's really interesting to look at some of this historically. In the past, the SAT has had a number of characteristics that have been biased, and it's been biased toward a majority race that is from a wealthy background. Some classic analogies, where they give one word as to another word as, and then you got to fill it in. But real items were oarsman is to regatta. You need to know what a regatta is. Opera is to aria. Okay, that was a real analogy. A harpsichord is to a piano. These are things that you need to know the meaning of the words in the analogy.
Yeah.
They're math items to do with war or sports, and so are there performance differences on that. Imagine, Greg, for you and me, that we asked a cluster of math questions that asked about cricket. Well, I don't know about you, but I know exactly nothing about cricket, but 1/3 of the globe would.
In a one-day international cricket match, Team A bats first and scores 286 runs in their full 50 overs. Now Team B is chasing the target. After 32 overs, Team B has scored 192 runs with 4 wickets lost. What is the required run rate for Team B to win the match?
That's the first thing that we're going to pound a nail into. Do two people with the same latent ability score equitably on the exam despite individual difference variables?
And I love what Patrick was doing there because he originally framed out psychometric bias from the perspective of the instrument as a whole, but the instrument is made up of a collection of items. Sometimes there is the potential for this kind of bias to creep into an individual item. Sometimes it could creep into a collection of items like a reading passage that might be on subject matter that some people already have a lot of prior knowledge on the basis of culture or ethnicity or race or gender. And so that whole constellation of items might wind up favoring people with that prior knowledge. And this is the most important point, even though they have the same degree of the underlying construct. So two groups that have the same level of reading comprehension, but one group is already more familiar with the topic that they're supposed to be reading about, they would have an advantage over another group. So this idea of bias can exist at the test level or at the item level.
And think about your own tests that you make. When I was a first-year assistant professor, I had an undergrad stat. I gave a midterm. I asked some questions. And I hardly knew anything about how to do this well. I asked a question about RBIs. Runs batted in. Well, everybody knows what an RBI is, right? Well, after the test, an international student came up and in a very gentle way said, "Excuse me, Professor Curran, I don't know what RBI is." And so these big umbrella things that Greg and I are talking about appear in your own creation of tests or evaluations. Think about, is it tapping into something other than the underlying latent construct? That's the big thing.
Yes.
Because we want it to uniquely tap into math, not also whether you know the game of baseball.
So talking about these psychometric issues and some of the cultural overlay on the items and the test itself, the kinds of questions that leads me to are things like, well, if someone claims that there is bias in this exam or in the items on this exam, I would want to know, what is the College Board or whatever the agency is, what are they doing to review the content of the items? Who are they having create the items? How are they analyzing the items across different groups to help establish whether or not there is this kind of bias, or as we would say more generally, differential item functioning or differential test functioning? What are they doing as part of their process? And is it an ongoing process, right? Is it that once they've reviewed an item or a test, they consider it done? Or do they have woven into the fabric of their testing process a constant review and updating of things? So for me to claim something about bias, I would need to know a little bit more about the processes that are in place or are not in place.
My understanding is College Board has legions of people working on this, because historically there was bias in items, but they generate hundreds of items. They apply it to thousands of kids and try their best to narrow it down to a subset of items that behave the same. If you're a factor analyst, it's measurement invariance. If you're an item response theorist, it's differential item functioning. But it is, does the item relate to the underlying construct equivalently across individual difference variables? And my understanding is that as of now, there's limited evidence that the SAT is biased from a psychometric definition of the term. But here's the trick. This is a living document. That changes with time. We came from decades ago. We're going to go into decades into the future. Our society is changing. Cultures are changing. Access is changing. And this needs to be done continually over time. You can't just build a test and say it is now unbiased.
Right.
So from a psychometric perspective, this is a clear and present danger every day of the week.
That is a very good point. So we mentioned a little bit about the questions that one might ask about the construction of the test itself. There's also a question, though, about what people do with the test, what people use those scores for, right? Because we don't just get scores and go, hey, congratulations, you got a 1520. Something happens to those scores. They are used for things. And so the idea of bias is not just something to consider when we're looking at the scores themselves. It's also how those scores are used for prediction.
That is so insanely important. Again, there are entire papers, there are entire programs of research that have looked at this. But what Greg is talking about is predictive validity. So think about, from a classic testing perspective, you identify a theoretical construct, you develop a set of items, you narrow them down to those that show the least amount of diff across individual difference variables, and then you hold a score in your hand.
Yeah.
All right, so Greg said 1520. A lot of people, all of the focus is on that 1520. Is that accurate? Is it biased? But part of test theory is, does it predict equitably across individual difference variables, whether that be race, culture, wealth, rurality, political affiliation, whatever that might be? I have seen a lot of conversations that people just take that as a given, that it's equally predictive. And so let's think about what that form of bias is. Now, Greg and I get, let's say, unbiased SAT scores. All right, you and I are each holding the truth as God sees it. That doesn't mean that they're equivalently predictive of how we're going to perform in college, right? That's the whole point of the SAT, is looking at academic preparation to predict future success. There's absolutely no information in that 1520 that says it's equally predictive for the two of us. It may be you come from an urban setting, I come from a rural setting, and it's a much worse predictor for me. So there's bias in terms of the predictive validity of the very reason that we're using it in college admissions.
Right. And what Patrick is getting at is that this is used to try to predict how successful you will be in college, which, by the way, usually is just measured by your college GPA. But the way the score is done right now, we have both a verbal and a quantitative score that are combined. Imagine that I pursue something that's very quantitative, and Patrick benefited us all by not going toward anything quantitative. If Patrick had done really, really well or really, really poorly on the quantitative section, that just might not be so relevant for the success or failure that he has when he gets to college. So the idea of this test as a whole, or parts that go into this test being differentially predictive across race, ethnicity, rurality, wealth status, etc., seems like a very reasonable thing to want to understand. And I really would want to know about that as part of the bias conversation.
And here's a poke in the eye. You're not going to know about that. When you teach undergrad stat, you draw an XY scatter plot where you fit a line and there's a strong positive relation. And then you erase all the points that are below some cutoff on X and look at the relation between X and Y, and there's a near zero correlation. It's called a restriction of range. Well, part of the problem is some people will argue, well, the SAT has no predictive validity. It has a very low correlation with GPA in first year of college. But you admitted people based on their SAT, so you have a restriction of range. I am making no statement about whether it is predictive or not predictive, but to truly evaluate what Greg just described, we would need to admit across the range of SAT to see if, one, there's a predictive relation with college performance, and two, is it moderated by individual difference variables? Because if it is, that could fundamentally undermine the general use of the SAT, as if you're treating the 1520 as the same for all people, then that is bias in the predictive utility of that measure.
You're absolutely right. And the way you described it was that there may be a linear relation that possibly differs across groups, which would be a very big problem from a predictive bias perspective, because the test would be showing itself to be somewhat less relevant to the success for one group over the other. But even in this conversation, we're assuming it's a linear relation. The relation could even be more complicated. It might be something where above a certain point on the SAT, you're guaranteed to do well in college, and below a certain point, you're almost certainly going to have a harder time. So imagine that there is some minimum threshold for anticipated success in college. That's not exactly a linear relation. And if that relation differs across groups, but we're using the instrument in the same way, right? If we said, we're not even going to look at anybody unless they have a 1460. Well, if that threshold for success differs across groups, then we're also using this in some sort of predictively biased way. But as you said, this is really hard to know because no one is allowing us to do that study where we get the full range of X and the full range of Y.
Could I annoy your sister-in-law a little bit more?
Wait.
All right, so again, second glass of wine.
Okay, sure.
And on her second glass of wine, she says the SAT is biased. So we want to annoy her a little bit. And so the first question is, well, do you mean that from a psychometric perspective? The second question we say, or do you mean that from a predictive validity perspective? The third is, well, do you mean that from an access and preparation perspective? Because this is... Okay, no, folks, I really like this. Greg and I try to go back and forth in the conversation and we trade terms and whatnot. And I said that, and he gave me a bit of a Cheshire cat grin and leaned back and clearly wants me to go on to this next topic.
I got to go to the bathroom. You go ahead.
Go grab the tennis ball, will you?
Aim it at your neighbor's garage.
It wasn't aimed there. It bounced off a parked car.
Okay. All right.
So let's take for granted that the SAT is an assessment of academic preparation. Academic preparation is a function of schooling, home support, community support, family support, financial support. Ergo, is there bias as a function of individual characteristics? And let's focus, for example, on family wealth to quality school and test preparation that would differentially prepare a student to perform better on the test had they not had that preparation or schooling. I'm in North Carolina, and we have a really fascinating state because they're almost like three different states, as we have the Western Mountains, we have the Eastern Seashore, and then we have the middle of the state, which is kind of blue dots in a red ocean, where we have Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill, and Charlotte, and then very rural mountain and Eastern Seashore. My kids went to a high school that offered 27 AP classes.
Wow.
27. I have a very good friend who is a teacher in Burgaw County High School, and that is a county that's out on the Eastern Seashore, and they have 3. Okay, now let's talk about bias in terms of access to learning about the volume of a cone. Have I annoyed my sister-in-law yet?
I'm pretty sure yes. No matter what you say, honestly. Everything that you just said really resonates with me. You know, in the county where we live, kids will ask each other, who is your college coach, right? There are a lot of kids who, in their junior or senior year, they are paying someone to help guide them through the preparation process for exams, the application process for colleges, the review of essays that they're crafting. And then there are other kids who that's a dream, right? That's not financially realistic. It's not something that is within the family experience. I know I certainly didn't have that growing up. And it starts to make me wonder if I'm in the region of bias or I'm in the region of fairness or equity. Because in the end, if kids have scores that are different, that may be an accurate reflection of how well they have mastered the content that that test is assessing. But then there's a fairness issue that is gnawing at me because some of those kids didn't have access to the same preparatory kind of services available. So I'm feeling uneasy about that one.
Oh, and you should, because this is the big observable issue with the SAT. There are consistent and unambiguous differences in test scoring as a function of these individual difference variables. Let's pretend the test is unbiased from a psychometric standpoint. Let's pretend the test is unbiased from a predictive validity standpoint. That doesn't mean that there's not a true and valid measure of an underlying construct where there are fundamental societal inequities that lead to different experiences, different access to teaching and learning that are reflected in these subgroup differences. So again, I'm just saying hypothetically, we could have a reliable and valid test in anything, but if Greg lives in a neighborhood that feeds a high school with 20 AP classes and I do not, or Greg can afford a test prep class and I cannot, the SAT is an unbiased test that accurately reflects fundamental societal subgroup differences.
So then the hot button question for me is, would we say the SAT is biased in that case, or would we say that there are structural inequities that lead to differential performance on the SAT? That to me is one of the things that's harder to wrestle with here.
So then if you do 1,500 on the SAT and I get 1,100 on the SAT, we always come back to alternative hypotheses. One is that you have a higher level of latent academic preparation than I do. The other is your parents are wealthier and gave you the resources to obtain a higher score, yet you and I are both equally likely to flourish in college. So then we're back with our sister-in-law and we say, what do you mean it should be banned? Should we stop the SAT entirely? Should we use that as a measure of national academic preparation, but we ban it from college admissions? Or do we use it in college admissions and ban that cutoffs and rules be used? So again, remember, our goal here is to annoy this person. What do you mean by ban?
In the end, whether or not it should be banned, I just don't know. In order to make a decision like that, I would need to have good answers to questions about whether or not it is psychometrically biased, as we mentioned before, and what processes are in place to try to make sure that any psychometric bias that occurs at the level of the test or the level of the items is dealt with and dealt with continuously. I would need satisfactory answers to how this instrument is used from a predictive standpoint and that it is not differentially predictive across groups. Because if it is, that wouldn't necessarily be bias in the test, but it would be bias in the use of the test. And then I would have to know how to internally calibrate the idea that in leading up to taking that test, people have very different journeys to get there, and those journeys can lead to different outcomes. So whether or not it should be banned, I don't know. But these are some of the questions that I have to wrestle with.
What I think about goes back to a very widely used phrase. It wasn't me, it wasn't anybody in particular. I've heard this a lot, but that banning the SAT is like banning the thermometer because you don't like that it's cold outside. For me, just from a strictly colloquial standpoint, let's pretend, and again, I'm stressing, let's pretend the SAT is a reliable and valid assessment of academic preparation, and let's pretend that it is equitably predictive across individual difference variables. And in turn, that test reflects societal disparities in access to high-quality education. In banning it, we're losing the only way we have to track those disparities. In one hand, you have that thermometer, but in the other hand, as you highlight, to what extent do we have confidence that the numerical value on that thermometer is reliable and valid? And that, I think, is where the tension is. So in banning it, are we doing away with a fundamentally flawed evaluation method? Or are we giving up a mirror that we hold up to our country to reflect economic disparities in access to fundamental K-12 education? That's the question I have. Greg nicely reviewed the broader questions from kind of an academic one. I'm messing with my sister-in-law just for fun. Now, I've had a hypothetical sister-in-law. My real sister-in-law, she actually has a master's in nutrition and is hyper healthy. And she once slapped a piece of toast out of my hand because it was burned. There's evidence that burned things are carcinogens. This is the real sister-in-law slapping the piece of toast out of my hand. I really admired it because she weighs like 100 pounds. And man, that piece of toast flew across the room. But if you want to mess with your sister-in-law, the questions that we're asking is, oh, that's really interesting. What do you mean by bias? And what do you mean by banned? Pour another glass of wine and watch the fun unfold. You may not know this, but as a fun little anecdote, after pontificating about the SAT as long as we have, I never took the SAT.
What?
Yeah.
You didn't have to take it? Or?
At the time, if you were in a public high school in Colorado and had above a 3.0 GPA, you were guaranteed admission to the University of Colorado. I never took the SAT. I never took a standardized test. When my kids were prepping for theirs, I was like, Godspeed. So folks, after listening to me for this long, holding forth about the SAT, yep, I never actually took the SAT.
As shocked as they might be at that, even more shocking is that you achieved at least a 3.0 GPA in high school.
And do you know why? Banned. I got C's and A's. And the magic of averages is I had like a 3.01 GPA because of banned.
Your trumpet was good for something.
So everybody, we really appreciate you puzzling through this with us. We hope you found it of some use. I mean, to reiterate yet again, we had no intent on drawing any conclusions, answering any questions, making any recommendations. This is how do we apply our quantitude to this premise and have a bit of fun in puzzling through a really, really important topic.
Yeah. Thanks very much, everybody, for being with us. Take care.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much for joining us. You can subscribe to Quantitude on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you go for all your test prep needs. You can also follow us on X, Blue Sky, or Instagram. We are at QuantitudePod. And visit our website at quantitudepod.org, where you can leave us a message, find playlists, show notes, class syllabi, and other fun stuff. Finally, get cool Quantitude merch like mugs, stickers, and notebooks from redbubble.com, where all proceeds from non-bootleg authorized sellers go to donorschoose.org to help support low-income schools. You have been listening to Quantitude, Practice item number 32. Quantitude is to podcasting as A. The Hindenburg is to luxury travel. B. Prince Harry is to the House of Windsor. C. RFK Jr. is to a healthy lifestyle. Or D. All of the above.